Eliza Marguerite Hartwell, Duchess of Renfrew, stood in the corridor outside her husband's study with a letter about drowned barley in her hand, and she did not knock. She did not raise her voice to the closed door 6 feet away. She did not ask the footman standing sentry beside it whether the Duke might spare her one unscheduled minute. She asked Mr. Coombe, the Duke's secretary, for an appointment, because that was the order of things at Renfrew, and Mr. Coombe consulted the black leather book he kept chained by habit, if not by iron to his left wrist, and told her that His Grace could receive her on Thursday at 3 o'clock for a quarter of an hour between the wool factor and the man from the drainage company. The water meadow at Long Fen would be 4 days further under by Thursday. She knew this the way she knew her own hands. She did not say it twice. She took the pencil from behind Mr. Coombe's ear, and before the secretary could decide whether that was permitted, she wrote one word beside the Thursday entry that bore her name, sandwiched between Mr. Aldous, the wool factor, and Mr. Price of the drainage company, as though she too were a tradesman come to sell the Duke something. The word was cancelled. She closed the book herself, set it down square with the edge of the desk, and walked back toward the east stair, with the drowned barley letter still folded in her glove, because there were 3 tenant families who needed to hear from her within the hour, appointment or none, and she had never in 11 months required Mr. Coombe's permission to visit them. By the time the Duke of Renfrew looked up from his ledgers to notice that Thursday had come and gone without his wife in the chair across from him, it would be too late to matter to him in the way he expected it to matter. It would matter a great deal more, and differently, by the following spring. That was a year neither of them could see yet from where they stood, and so this is where the story must go back. To the beginning of the arrangement that made a cancelled Thursday feel, to everyone at Renfrew who heard of it, like the first crack in a very old dam. The autumn of 1816 came to Hampshire the way it always did, wet and unhurried, laying its fog low over the water meadows, and its silence low over the great houses. And it was in that particular autumn, 13 months before the cancelled Thursday, that Eliza Hartwell had come to Renfrew as a bride of 21, with a dead father's ledgers in her trunk, and no dowry worth the name attached to her person. Her father, Thomas Hartwell, had been a land agent of modest reputation and exacting habits, the kind of man who trusted a column of figures further than he trusted a man's face. And he had died the spring before her marriage, leaving her 3 maxims she had by then worn smooth with repeating. A promise you do not write down is a promise you did not intend to keep. Count what is owed you before you count what you are given. Grief is honest work, but it is not the only work, and it does not excuse you from the rest. Julian Faircross, Duke of Renfrew, had married her for reasons that were never spoken aloud at the wedding breakfast, but were perfectly well understood by everyone attending it. Her father's competence had left her fluent in the language the Duke's own estate most badly needed: drainage, rents, arrears, the slow arithmetic by which a great house either thrives or quietly bleeds to death. And the Duke, whose own father had left him an estate half drowned in debt and wholly drowned in a doctrine about what love did to a man who let it in, required a wife who could be useful without requiring in turn to be attended to. He was not cruel. He was orderly. He built his affections the way he built his fences, in straight lines, at measured distances, with gates that opened only at fixed hours, and he called this system fairness because his father had taught him, 20 years before, that a woman given unscheduled access to a man's time was a woman who would eventually own the man entire, and would then leave as his own mother had left, taking the silver and the scents from the house both. So Eliza had learned, in 13 months, to submit her days to Mr. Coombes' black book. She had learned that her husband would see her at breakfast, formally, and again at dinner if there were no guests requiring his particular attention, and that anything falling outside those hours, a flooded meadow, a sick tenant, a question about the wool contract, required an appointment like any other petitioner's. She had not argued this arrangement, not because she accepted it as right, but because she had watched, in those 13 months, exactly what argument cost a woman in that house, and had decided early that her time was better spent proving herself right than proving him wrong. She managed the home farm's accounts without being asked. She corresponded with 3 of the tenant families in a hand the Duke did not know she used. She had, without any fuss at all, made herself indispensable to an estate that did not yet know it needed her, which was, she had come to understand, an entirely different thing from being loved by the man who owned it. It was this arrangement, precise and orderly, and entirely bloodless, that brought her to Mr. Coombes' black book on that particular Tuesday with a letter about drowned barley in her glove, and it was the answer she received there, Thursday, 3 o'clock, a quarter of an hour, sandwiched between a wool factor and a drainage man, that finally showed her, with a clarity she had been declining to reach for 13 months, exactly what she had been classified as, not a wife, an appointment, a line item filed under estate matters to be attended to when convenient and not before. She did not weep over it. She went to see the Carew family about their flooding fields instead, because there was work to be done, and the work, unlike her husband, did not require a Thursday. The blow that finished the arrangement came 4 nights later, at a dinner Eliza had not wanted, and could not decently refuse, held to welcome a guest whose arrival she had learned of only that morning, Lady Constance Vane, a childhood friend of the Duke's late mother's family, come to stay a fortnight at Renfrew, on the strength of an old acquaintance nobody had troubled to explain to Eliza in advance. Lady Vane was handsome in the particular unhurried way of women who had never needed to hurry, and she took the chair beside Julian at table with the ease of someone returning to a place long reserved for her. And Eliza watched her husband's face do something it did not often do around her, soften, very slightly, at the corners, the way ice softens before anyone would call it water. It was over the second course that Sir Reginald Pell, 3 glasses into the claret, and never a man to read a room before speaking into it, turned to the Duke and asked, in the hearty voice of a man who thought himself charming, how married life suited him, whether the Duchess had settled the household to his liking, whether he had found himself, as married men so often complained, at the mercy of a wife's whims and humours. Julian had set down his glass with the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he dislikes, and Eliza had watched him choose his words the way he chose everything, for economy rather than warmth. A wife, he said, is a necessary office. Mine performs it admirably. The table laughed, gently, the laugh of people who had heard worse, said more cruelly, and did not notice the smaller cruelty in this. Lady Vane's mouth curved. Eliza felt the words land somewhere below her ribs and stay there, the way a stone stays where it is thrown, rather than where it is meant to land. She did not scream, she did not weep, she did not set down her own glass too hard, or push back her chair, or excuse herself with any visible haste. She finished the fish course. She asked Mrs. Denby, on her left, a question about her daughter's confinement, and listened to the answer with what appeared to be whole attention. She waited until the ladies withdrew, and only then, in the still room behind the kitchens, where no one but Mrs. Pruitt the housekeeper would think to look for her, did she permit herself 10 minutes by the mantel clock. 10 minutes exactly, counted the way her father had taught her to count grief as a debt that must be serviced and then closed, to feel the thing she had decided. At the table. She would not feel in front of an audience. At the end of the 10 minutes she washed her face, and found Mrs. Pruitt standing in the doorway with a cup of tea she had not asked for, and clearly needed anyway. "He does not mean unkindness by it," Mrs. Pruitt said. In the flat way she said everything, as though testing whether the words held water before she offered them. "That is his father's tongue in his mouth. Doesn't make it taste better going down." "No," Eliza said. "It does not." She drank the tea. "I find I am no longer interested in whether he means it. What are you interested in, then, Your Grace?" Eliza set down the cup, both hands steady, and thought of the water meadow at Long Fen, still under 4 inches of standing water, because a meeting to discuss it had been scheduled for a day the Fields could not afford to wait for. In being an office no one can afford to close, she said, and went to find her cloak, because the drainage men would want instruction in the morning whether or not the Duke had found time to give it, and she had work to do. The Long Fen meadow flooded 14 acres of the estate's best water meadow every autumn that the upper sluice went untended, and it had gone untended for 6 years, because the previous Duke had considered drainage an expense beneath urgent attention, and the current Duke had inherited both the meadow and the neglect without examining either. Eliza examined both within a week. She rode out with Hob Carrow, whose family had farmed the low fields at Renfrew for 3 generations, and had lost, by his own reckoning, above 30 pounds of hay each of the last 4 autumns to standing water, and she asked him questions no one at the house had troubled to ask him before. Not how bad the flooding was, which everyone already knew, but exactly where the water rose first. And how fast, and whether it was the sluice gate itself or the culvert beneath the lane that failed first. Hob Carrow, a broad, slow-spoken man who had buried 2 children and expected little from great houses beyond rent collection, answered her plainly because she had asked him plainly, and by the end of that week Eliza had a survey of her own drawing, done in her father's method, showing that the true fault lay not in the sluice gate at all, but in a culvert blocked 11 years, running with silt no one had ever paid to clear, at a cost she calculated, checking her figures twice, at £4 and some odd shillings, a sum so far beneath what the estate had lost in ruined hay each autumn since, that she nearly laughed reading her own sum a second time. £4, Hob Carrow said, when she showed him the figure, turning his hat in both hands the way he did when he was working out whether to trust something. 6 years of drowned hay for £4 of digging. 6 years of no one asking the right question, Eliza said, which costs considerably more than £4, though it never appears in anyone's accounts. She had the culvert cleared within the fortnight, paying the labourers from the small allowance she kept from her own pin money, rather than wait on Mr. Coombs' book to grant her an appointment to request it from the estate purse, and when the November rains came, and the meadow at Longfen stayed dry for the first time in 6 years, Hob Carrow told every tenant on the low fields, and most of them told each other, and within a month it was known across the home farm that the young Duchess had solved in a fortnight, for £4, a problem the estate had carried for 6 years, and some £100 of ruined hay. It was Mrs. Pruitt who told the Duke, not Eliza, because Eliza had not thought to, being occupied with the wool accounts by then, where she had found an anomaly she did not yet understand. a discrepancy of some £11 between the fleece-weight grissom the steward recorded at shearing and the sum the wool factor's receipt showed paid, a difference too small to catch a careless eye and too consistent, across 4 years of ledgers, to be anything but deliberate. The Duke found her in the estate office that evening, bent over 4 years of wool accounts by candlelight, and he stood in the doorway some while before she noticed him, which she counted, afterward, as the first time he had ever come to find her, rather than summoned her to be found. "Mrs. Pruitt tells me the Long Fen meadow is dry," he said. "It is, for £4. £4, and some shillings, your Grace." The culvert wanted clearing. No one had asked. He came further into the room and looked at the ledgers spread before her, and said nothing for a moment that stretched long enough to become its own kind of statement. "You might have asked me for the funds. I did not require an appointment to spend my own pin money," Eliza said, without looking up, and Thursday was some while off. It was not said unkindly. It was said the way she said most things now, plainly, with the fact laid flat on the table like a coin, and she watched him receive it, not flinch, not argue, simply receive it, the way a man receives a bill he had not expected but cannot dispute. He did not apologize. He was not yet, she understood, a man who apologized, but he stood a while longer than the conversation required, watching her mark the wool discrepancy in the margin, and when he left he did not summon Mr. Combe to record that he had been there. That, Eliza thought, watching the door close, was as near to an unscheduled visit as her husband had paid her in 13 months of marriage, and she permitted herself to notice it the way she permitted herself the 10 minutes by the mantel clock. Counted, acknowledged, and then set aside in favour of the work still waiting on the desk. The wool discrepancy did not resolve itself so easily as the culvert had. Eliza spent 3 evenings against 4 years of Grissom's shearing tallies before she was certain enough to be dangerous, and certainty, she had learned from her father, was the only currency worth spending against a man who controlled the books. She found in the end a pattern rather than a single theft. £11 here, 9 there, never round numbers, never in the same column twice. The discreet arithmetic of a man who had learned exactly how much could be taken from an estate too large and too poorly watched to notice. Across 4 years it totalled, by her count, £340. She did not confront Grissom. She copied the figures into her own hand, in her father's method, and set them aside where she could find them again. Because a document shown too soon was a document wasted, and she had not yet decided what use this one would serve. It was Mrs. Pruitt, again, who gave her the second half of what she needed to understand her husband, on an evening some weeks later, when the Duke had ridden out to the far pasture and would not return before dark. Eliza had asked carefully why a man otherwise reasonable kept his own wife on a tradesman's schedule, and Mrs. Pruitt, who had served the house since before Julian was breeched, answered in her flat way that held water better than most people's careful speeches. "His mother left when he was 9, Mrs., Pruitt said. Took the Renfrey pearls and a good part of the quarter's rents with her, and a colonel besides, and the old Duke never forgave the boy for loving her so plain and so loud beforehand. Taught him after that a woman given free run of a man's time, and his purse would ruin him surer than drink. Taught it to him the way you'd teach a boy his letters, every day, until it took. And it took, Mrs., Pruitt agreed. Doesn't mean it's true, only means he believes it the way you or I believe the sun'll rise." Eliza turned this over for some days, the way she turned over a column of figures that would not quite balance, and found that it did not excuse the dinner table, or Mr. Coombe's book, or the quarter hour between the wool factor and the drainage man. A wound explained was not a wound forgiven, but it altered, slightly, the shape of what she was building toward. She was no longer merely proving herself indispensable. She was disproving, one culvert and one ledger at a time, a doctrine 20 years installed. Meanwhile, the county had begun, in its slow tidal way, to speak of her differently. Lady Vane, still a fortnight's guest grown somehow into a month's, had noticed the turning too, and moved to counter it in the manner Eliza had by then learnt to expect from a woman who weaponized paper the way a soldier weaponized powder, quietly, and to the right audience first. She let it be known, in careful confidence to the Duke's aged aunt, that she possessed a letter, an old one, from before the Duke's marriage, hinting at an understanding between herself and Julian that had never been properly dissolved. She did not show it yet. She let its existence do the work a document does before it is ever produced, which is to make people afraid of what it might say. Eliza heard of the letter within a week, the way she heard most things now, through Mrs. Pruitt's network of maids and grooms who had come, without any campaign on her part, to trust the Duchess with what they would not have trusted to the house's official channels. She did not panic over it. She wrote its existence into her own private book beside the wool figures and went back to work, because a threat named was a threat halved, and a threat undocumented was, she suspected, mostly bluff, though she did not yet know how much. It was on a wet evening in December, with the wool discrepancy £340 proven and Lady Vane's letter still unproduced, that Julian came to the estate office unannounced for the second time. And this time he did not stand in the doorway. He crossed the room, and stood at the desk across from her, and said, without preamble, my father kept a room locked, in the west wing. I have not opened it since he died. Eliza set down her pen. I should like you to see it, he said, if you would come. The room, when he unlocked it, smelled of dust and old paper, and something colder that Eliza took some moments to identify as the particular stillness of a place kept shut on purpose rather than by neglect. It held his father's private papers, estate correspondence, yes, but also a slim locked box that Julian opened with a key he had clearly never used, containing letters from his mother, unanswered, dated across 11 years after she left, each one asking after her son by name, and none of them, by the evidence of the unbroken seals, ever opened by the boy they were addressed to, or the father who had kept them from him. He told me she never wrote, Julian said. He was very still, saying it, the stillness of a man doing arithmetic he dislikes and cannot now undo. He told me she never once asked. Eliza did not touch the letters. She let him hold that discovery in his own hands as long as he required, and when he finally looked at her, she said the only thing she had, which was not comfort, because comfort was not yet owed and she did not deal in currency she had not earned the right to spend. Your father was wrong about her, she said. I do not know yet whether that means he was wrong about the rest of it. I have run this house 11 months, Julian said, believing a woman's whole time was a debt she meant to collect against me eventually. I do not know how to unbelieve a thing my father spent 9 years teaching me. Then do not ask me to trust the belief, Eliza said. Show me the unbelieving instead. Not tonight, and not with words. Show me over time, and I will tell you when I have seen enough of it to call it true. He nodded once, the way he agreed to a boundary rather than a comfort, and it was there, in the locked room that smelled of old paper, that he took Mr. Coombes' black appointment book from under his arm. She had not noticed he carried it, and set it on the desk between them. "I meant to burn it," he said. "Don't," Eliza said. "Burning it lets you feel you have changed something. Change what is written in it instead, and I will believe that." He did not answer that at once. But he did not take the book away again either, and when Eliza left the locked room that night, it was Julian who carried it back to his own study, under his own arm, where it had not gone unaccompanied by his secretary in longer than either of them could easily recall. The document that finally rewrote Lady Vane's claim came not from the locked room, but from Eliza's own trunk, from the ledgers her father had left her, which she had packed and never fully unpacked in 13 months of marriage, because grief, even serviced in counted minutes, does not always clear a trunk on schedule. She went through them in January with Mr. Abernathy, the family solicitor, a small precise man who trusted paper the way her father had, and distrusted everything else in equal measure, and it was Abernathy who found, in her father's own hand, the record she had not known to look for 11 years prior. Thomas Hartwell, in his capacity as land agent, had witnessed and recorded a settlement of £2,000 paid to Miss Constance Vane's family upon the dissolution of an informal understanding with the young Julian Faircross, then heir presumptive to Renfrey, a settlement made, and accepted, and receipted, in a hand Abernathy confirmed against 3 other specimens as unmistakably Lady Vane's own father's. She was paid to release whatever claim she believed she held, Abernathy said, turning the receipt to the light. 11 years ago. In full. This letter she is said to possess now, hinting at an unbroken understanding, if it exists at all, was written, if it was written honestly, before this settlement was ever paid. She has simply neglected to mention that her family accepted £2,000 to consider the matter closed. Can we prove the letter false, if she does produce it? We may not need to, Abernathy said. We need only prove the settlement true. A closed matter cannot reopen itself merely because someone wishes it open. Lady Vane's counterstroke came 4 days later, faster than Eliza had expected and sharper. Not the old letter after all, but a sworn statement from the Reverend Silas Whately, an elderly clergyman, with a parish 2 counties distant, attesting that he had, some 12 years past, performed a private ceremony of betrothal between Julian Faircross and Constance Vane binding enough, in the church's old and half-forgotten reckoning, to cast a shadow over any marriage made afterward, without its formal dissolution. Eliza read the statement twice, and did not raise her voice over it, and did not send for the Duke in alarm. She sent instead for Abernathy, and asked him a single question, whether Reverend Whatley's parish accounts showed any unusual receipt of funds in the months before his statement was sworn. They showed £40, paid in November, from a source the parish register recorded only as CV. The public recalibration came at the Colebrook Assizes dinner in February, an evening the whole county attended, because the magistrate presiding, Sir Aubrey Latham, was retiring that spring, and every family of consequence for 20 miles had come to see him off, and, as county dinners always did, to watch each other. Lady Vane had, by then, let her sworn statement circulate widely enough that half the room believed some scandal hung unresolved over the Duke of Renfrey's marriage, and it was Julian himself, at Eliza's quiet request, who rose before the assembled company and asked Sir Aubrey, as a magistrate and an old friend of the family, whether he would permit a matter of some delicacy to be settled there, before witnesses, rather than left to fester as county gossip. Eliza stood when Sir Aubrey nodded, and she did not raise her voice, because she had learned that a room quiets faster for a woman who does not ask it to. Lady Vane has represented, she said, that an unbroken understanding exists between herself and my husband, supported by a clergyman's sworn testimony of a private ceremony 12 years past. She laid Abernathy's copied settlement receipt on the table before Sir Aubrey. I would ask the room only to consider one document before it considers any other. This is a settlement of £2,000, paid by the Duke's family to Lady Vane's family 11 years ago, upon the dissolution of any prior understanding, witnessed and recorded by my late father in his capacity as land agent, and receipted in Lady Vane's own father's hand. The room's murmur was not loud, but Eliza heard it turn, the way water turns at a sluice gate finally cleared. If a binding ceremony had truly occurred 12 years past, she went on, I wonder why a settlement was sought and accepted the following year to dissolve an understanding that could not, by Reverend Whatley's own account, have been dissolved by payment at all. One of these two claims must be false. I have brought the receipt. I would ask Lady Vane whether she has brought anything beyond a clergyman's word. It was here that the room's turning became a tide, because Reverend Whatley himself had been persuaded to attend, at Abernathy's quiet arrangement and under Sir Aubrey's precise and unhurried questioning. 3 questions only, each shorter than the last, the old clergyman's composure came apart in the particular way composure comes apart when it was never built on anything but fear of a smaller debt. He had been paid, he admitted, £40, to swear to a ceremony he had in fact never performed. He had needed the money for his parish roof. He had not thought, he said, that anyone would examine it so closely. Something behind Lady Vane's own composure went out at that moment, visibly, the way a lamp goes out not from being struck but from simply running dry, and she did not attempt to answer the room's silence with anything at all. Eliza could have ended her there. She had, by the room's own verdict already rendered, more than enough now to see Lady Vane's family pursued for fraud, the forged statement laid before the same magistrate in a harsher light, the county's memory of her made permanently unkind. She chose, instead, to speak once more before the room dispersed. I do not intend to pursue the matter further, she said. The settlement stands as it always stood. I would ask only that Lady Vane consider the county's memory as payment enough for a debt she has already discharged in full, twice over, and that she not require a third accounting. She did not look at Lady Vane as she said it, which was, everyone in the room understood, its own kind of mercy, the mercy of a woman who has chosen not to watch another woman's ruin as entertainment. That night, in the coach home, Julian sat across from her in the dark, and it was some while before he spoke. I owe you an accounting, he said, not merely an apology. My aunt tells me there is a difference, and I confess I did not understand it until tonight. There is a difference, Eliza said. An apology says you are sorry for the harm. An accounting says why the harm happened, in full, without softening it in the telling. I will hear the second before I have much use for the first. So he gave it to her, in the dark of the coach, and then again by the fire once they were home, the whole of it, his mother's leaving, his father's 9 years of careful teaching, the doctrine that a wife's unscheduled access to a man was the first stone in a wall that would end with the house emptied, and the man made a fool before the county. The appointment book built not from unkindness, but from a fear so old he had stopped recognising it as fear at all, and had begun, instead, to call it good management. He did not excuse any of it. He set it down the way she had taught him, without ceremony, the fact laid flat like a coin. "That is the accounting," Eliza said, when he had finished. "Now the apology, if you have one, though I would rather have the next part." The next part. "My conditions," she said. "If you wish this marriage to continue on terms I can live inside, rather than merely survive." She had written them, in fact, in her father's method, in her own book some weeks before, and she recited them now the way she recited a column of figures, plainly, one at a time. "I will keep the household accounts in my own name, not as your delegate, but as their author. Mr. Coombs' book will carry no entry for me, ever again, for any reason. I am not a tenant of your time, and I will not be scheduled into it. The tenant wage reforms I began at Long Fen and the home farm will stand as a state policy, not as my private charity. To be honoured after I am dead as much as while I live. And when you are afraid, for you will be afraid again, I do not doubt it, you will tell me so plainly, rather than build me a fence and call it fairness." Julian was quiet a long moment, the particular quiet of a man weighing terms he knows, even as he weighs them, that he intends to accept. "All right," he said. "All right, then," Eliza said, and that was very nearly the whole of it. The months that followed were not dramatic, and Eliza had not expected them to be, because she had told him once that she would judge the unbelieving by accumulation rather than by any single grand gesture, and accumulation was by its nature a slow and unremarkable thing. He moved his chair, without being asked, from the head of the breakfast table to the place beside hers. He began pouring her tea before she reached for the pot herself. A small thing, meaningless once, and meaning a great deal by the 20th repetition. He brought the estate ledgers to her of his own accord, rather than waiting for her to seek them out, and once, in March. He asked her opinion on a tenancy renewal before he had formed his own, which was so unlike the man who had married her that Mrs. Pruitt, observing it from the doorway, said nothing at all, which from Mrs. Pruitt was its own form of applause. There was one relapse, in April, and Eliza had expected that too, because a habit 20 years installed does not dissolve merely because a debt has been named and paid. Julian arranged, without consulting her, to let the old dower cottage to a distant cousin, needing a home, a decision that touched her own future interest in the property, and that he had made, out of old reflex, the way a man makes a decision alone when he has spent 20 years believing that was simply what deciding meant. She did not shout at him for it. She set the lease agreement on the table between them and said, "You have done the thing again. Not the cruelty, the old habit of deciding my house without me in the room." He looked at the paper a long moment, and then at her, and something in his face did the arithmetic honestly this time, all the way through. "I did," he said. "I am sorry. I will unwind it in the morning, with you present for the mending of it, if the cousin will permit the delay." "He will," Eliza said, "if he is decent, and if he is not. We will learn that too, and it will not be your fault twice over for the same fault." It was a small thing, the unwinding of a lease, but Eliza marked it in her private book the way she marked every small thing that autumn and winter, because her father had taught her that nothing means much in isolation, and everything means a great deal in accumulation, and by midsummer the accumulation had become its own kind of proof. It was in June, on the anniversary of the cancelled Thursday, that Julian found her in the estate office at dusk, the black appointment book, long since emptied of her name, and at his own order never again permitted to carry it, resting closed on the corner of the desk where it had sat, unused for family business, since February. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the necessary office." Eliza did not look up at once. "Your dinner table phrase. I remember it. I would like to say the opposite of it, if you will let me, and mean it as fully as I meant the first version, which is to say, entirely, and without qualification." He waited until she set down her pen and looked at him properly. "You were never an office, Eliza. You were the only necessary thing in this house I never scheduled, and always, without knowing the word for it, needed. That is nearly a declaration," Eliza said. "It is not the whole of it." He came around the desk and stood close enough that she had to tip her head to hold his eye, which she had rarely needed to do with him before. "I would choose you," he said, not as the boy raised to fear it would have chosen, with a lease and a ledger and a fence around the choosing. "I have been choosing you for some months now, in small ways. The way you taught me a thing must be proven, and I find I am not tired of it, and I do not expect to grow tired of it, and I would like to go on choosing you for whatever years are left to either of us, appointment or none." Eliza considered this the way she considered a column that finely balanced, with the particular satisfaction of arithmetic proven true rather than merely hoped true. "Then we are agreed," she said. "We are agreed," said Julian, and it was, in the fashion of their house by then, very nearly the whole treaty. 2 years passed the way years do at a well-run estate, which is to say, quietly, and mostly in the telling of small good things rather than large dramatic ones. Lady Constance Vane settled in Bath on a modest annuity of her own family's arranging, and troubled Renfrey no further. The county remembered her, when it remembered her at all, with more pity than malice, which Eliza had judged at the time. Punishment enough for a woman who had never in her life been taught another way to secure herself. Grissom the steward was let go quietly the spring after the wool discrepancy came to light, the £340 repaid across 2 years' wages rather than pursued through the courts, and Hob Carrow's eldest boy Tam, who had a gift for figures his father had never had occasion to discover in himself, was raised to the steward's post before he was 25, and kept the wool accounts, from that year forward, in a hand Eliza had personally taught him to check twice. The tenant wage reform Eliza had begun at Long Fen stood as a state policy still, posted each Lady Day on the granary door in Tam Carrow's neat hand, and was, by the 2nd year, simply how things were done at Renfrey, no longer spoken of as the Duchess's innovation because it had passed, the way good practices do, into the unremarkable fabric of the place. Mr. Coomb's black book remained in use for the wool factors and the drainage men and the ordinary petitioners of an estate's ordinary business, and carried, as promised, no family name ever again. But there was, by the 2nd summer, a different book entirely, a small plain one Eliza kept in her own desk, in which she and Julian had taken, without ever formally deciding to writing the first Thursday of each month as reserved, in neither hand alone but sometimes his and sometimes hers, for nothing more official than a walk to Longfen and back, to see the water lying where it ought to lie, and not where a father's old fear had once let it stand and drown 6 years of hay. No one had scheduled that Thursday. No one had appointed it. It simply recurred, because 2 people had chosen, separately and then together, to want it to. The house at Renfrey, which had held its breath for the better part of 30 years under 2 dukes who each in his own way had feared what a woman's free time might cost him, breathed differently by then. Visitors remarked on it, without quite being able to name what they were remarking on, a warmth in the rooms that owed nothing to the fires, a quiet that was rest rather than caution. Mrs. Pruitt, asked once by a new housemaid what had changed at Renfrey these past 2 years, considered the question the way she considered most things, and said only that the house used to hold its breath, and now it let it out, which the housemaid did not fully understand until she had served there a year herself, and then found she understood it perfectly. She had not asked, at the beginning, to be seen. She had asked quietly for a quarter of an hour on a Thursday, and been told to wait her turn behind a wool factor. She had stopped asking after that. She had made herself, instead, impossible to overlook, one culvert and one ledger and one steady Thursday at a time, not because she required the county's admiration, but because a woman's worth, once truly documented, does not need to be argued for again. She had learned, and taught without ever raising her voice to teach it, that being useful is not the same as being loved, and that a man who confuses the two will build you a schedule instead of a marriage, and call the schedule kindness. Love, when it finally came to Renfrey in earnest, did not arrive by appointment. It arrived on an ordinary Thursday, unscheduled and unannounced, and asked nothing of her but to be let in, and by then she had long since decided on what terms she would allow it, and on no others.